I never thought I'd see the day when my son, my strong, kind and bright-eyed Josh, would have his world shattered so thoroughly. At 23, he'd been on the cusp of settling down with the love of his life. Or so he thought. And then, in the cruelest twist of fate, he lost her and his closest friend in one devastating betrayal. The pain in his eyes the day he came to me, broken and raw, is something I'll never forget. He didn't even have to tell me. His entire being spoke of heartbreak. His shoulders slumped, his voice barely above a whisper. He recounted how Sarah, the woman he was planning to marry, had cheated on him with his best friend. I felt a sharp ache in my chest as he confessed he felt like his world had crumbled in an instant. "I don't know how to move on, Mom," he said, tears brimming in his brown eyes. "I trusted them both and now I feel like I've lost everything." It wasn't easy to watch him struggle, but I knew my role in this moment wasn't just to comfort him. It was to remind him of who he was. A man worthy of love, respect and loyalty, even if the world had failed to show it in this instance. "Josh," I said gently, placing my hand on his, "you haven't lost everything. You still have you. And you still have me." He smiled faintly through his tears, and I knew it was the first step toward helping him heal. Over the next few weeks, I made it my mission to give him the support he needed without suffocating him. When he wanted to talk, I listened without judgment. When he wanted silence, I offered quiet companionship. I cooked his favorite meals, the way I used to when he was a boy, hoping the comfort of a home-cooked dish might soothe his soul even a little. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching an old movie, Josh turned to me with a vulnerability I hadn't seen since he was a child. "How do you deal with feeling like you're not enough, Mom?" The question hit me like a wave. I'd been through my own heartbreaks in life, though I'd worked hard to shield him from those scars. "You remember the love you've given," I said softly. "You remind yourself that someone's betrayal says more about them than it ever will about you." Josh nodded, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. As time went on, I saw glimpses of the man he was before the heartbreak. He started going back to the gym, meeting friends, new ones thankfully, and even cracking jokes at dinner. But there were still moments when I could see the shadow of his loss. Those moments were when I stepped in, nudging him toward small joys and gentle reminders of his worth. One Saturday, I insisted we go on a hike, something he'd loved in high school but hadn't done in years. The crisp air and vibrant greenery seemed to lighten his spirit. As we sat at the summit, overlooking the town bathed in golden sunlight, he turned to me with a faint smile. "Thanks, Mom," he said, his voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "For everything. I wouldn't have gotten through this without you." I squeezed his hand. "You're stronger than you think, Josh. But you don't have to be strong alone." And in that moment, I felt a quiet gratitude, not just for being his mother, but for the privilege of walking beside him through this chapter of his life. Because no matter what life throws at us, love, the pure, unconditional kind, will always be our anchor. The shift was subtle at first, like the gradual warming of the earth after winter. Josh began to emerge from the haze of his heartbreak, and with that, something remarkable unfolded between us. It was as though he'd channeled his pain into something purposeful. He started to take care of me in ways I hadn't expected, ways that left me both comforted and strangely self-aware. One morning, as the sun streamed through the kitchen window, I woke to the smell of sizzling bacon and the sound of soft music. Still groggy, I followed the trail of aromas and sounds to the kitchen. There, Josh stood at the stove, a spatula in one hand and his hips swaying to the rhythm of the old jazz tune playing in the background. "Morning, Mom," he called over his shoulder, his grin as bright as the sunlight filtering through the window. I leaned against the doorway, watching him with a mix of amusement and wonder. He was dressed casually, a snug t-shirt accentuating the muscles he'd been carefully rebuilding at the gym. His confidence was returning, and with it came a charm that felt both familiar and new. "You're in a good mood," I remarked, smiling. "Of course," he replied, flipping a pancake with a flourish. "It's a beautiful day, and I've got the best breakfast partner in the world." I chuckled, shaking my head. "You've really turned into quite the gentleman." He turned then, his hazel eyes meeting mine with a depth that caught me off guard. I had a pretty amazing example growing up. There was a sincerity in his voice that rendered me speechless. I busied myself by grabbing plates, feeling a warmth rise to my cheeks. As we ate, he asked me about my day, my plans, even my old hobbies, the ones I'd quietly shelved over the years as life demanded my focus elsewhere. "You used to paint, didn't you?" he asked, his tone casual but genuinely curious. "I did," I admitted. "But it's been years." "You should get back to it," he encouraged. "You were so talented. I remember the mural you painted in my old room. I thought it was the coolest thing ever." His words stirred something in me, a long-dormant sense of pride and creativity. "Maybe I will," I said, surprising even myself. From that day on, Josh's attentiveness only deepened. He noticed things no one else ever seemed to. When I'd had a long day, he'd suggest watching one of my favorite old movies. If I mentioned a book I'd wanted to read, it would magically appear on the coffee table a few days later. He even started helping around the house without being asked, fixing creaky hinges and cleaning gutters with a cheerful diligence. It wasn't just the gestures, it was the way he looked at me, like I mattered in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. His presence filled the house with a warmth I hadn't realized I'd been missing. One evening after dinner, he suggested we go for a walk. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. As we strolled through the neighborhood, he offered me his arm, a small but gallant gesture that made me laugh. "Such a gentleman," I teased. "Always," he replied with a wink. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself noticing things about him I hadn't before. The way his laugh could light up a room, the strength in his hands as he carried groceries, the way his eyes softened when he looked at me. There were moments when our gazes would meet, and I'd feel a flutter of something I couldn't quite name. It was confusing, exhilarating, and undeniably real. One morning I caught him dancing in the kitchen again. This time I couldn't resist joining him. He laughed as I swayed to the beat, his joy infectious. "See, you've still got it," he teased, spinning me around. I laughed, my heart lighter than it had been in years. "Only because I have such a great dance partner." Our laughter echoed through the house, filling it with a life and energy I hadn't realized it had lacked. For the first time in a long time I felt truly seen, not just as a mother but as a person. That night as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the thought of him. His laughter, his strength, the way he'd held my gaze just a moment too long during breakfast. It was a dangerous path to tread, but it was impossible to deny. Something had shifted between us. Something profound, unspoken, and beautifully complex. The morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen curtains, bathing the room in a warm, golden glow. As I stepped into the kitchen, still in my robe, the smell of coffee greeted me first. The table was perfectly set. Pancakes stacked high, scrambled eggs, fresh fruit, and a steaming mug of my favorite tea. But it wasn't just the breakfast that made me pause. It was the note resting neatly beside my plate. "Good morning, beautiful. Enjoy your meal. I'll be back soon with a gift." I stared at the words, my heart skipping a beat. Beautiful. The way he'd written it felt more than just a casual compliment. It felt deliberate, personal. It made my pulse quicken, and for a fleeting moment, I felt like a young woman being courted, swept up in the thrill of something unexpected. I couldn't help the smile that spread across my face as I read the note again, running my fingers over the paper. A quiet excitement bubbled in my chest. He hadn't told me where he'd gone or what the gift might be, but the mystery was tantalizing. For the first time in what felt like years, I felt a spark, a desire to look my best, to feel radiant. I abandoned my breakfast momentarily and rushed upstairs, my robe trailing behind me. In my closet, I found a simple yet flattering dress that had been hanging untouched for ages. I slipped it on, the soft fabric hugging my figure in a way that reminded me I could still feel confident and beautiful. Next came the lipstick, a subtle shade of rose, and I carefully styled my hair, letting it fall loosely over my shoulders. I studied my reflection in the mirror, my cheeks warm with anticipation. Who was this woman staring back at me? She looked hopeful, alive. For years I had focused on practicality, on being the steady, dependable one. But now there was a thrill in allowing myself to feel special. When I heard the sound of the front door opening, my heart leapt. I hurried back downstairs, feeling like a teenager waiting for her date to arrive. Josh stepped into the house, his presence commanding the room. He was carrying a large box, but before I could register what it was, he closed the distance between us. "Morning," he said, his voice low and warm, his eyes locking with mine. Before I could respond, he leaned in and kissed me softly on the cheek. It wasn't a casual, fleeting kiss. This one lingered just long enough to make my breath hitch. I froze for a moment, caught in the intimacy of the gesture, my heart pounding in my chest. He pulled back slightly, a small smile playing on his lips as he handed me the box. "For you," he said simply. Still reeling, I took the box, feeling its weight as I carefully set it on the kitchen counter. I glanced at him, my eyes searching his face for some clue about what was inside. "Open it," he urged, his grin widening. I untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside was a stunning set of art supplies, a full range of paints, brushes of every size, and a collection of pristine canvases. The smell of fresh wood and paint filled the air as I ran my fingers over the items, my chest tightening with emotion. "Josh, my voice cracked as I looked at him. "This is incredible. I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied, his tone soft but steady. "I just want you to start painting again. I remember how happy it used to make you. You deserve to feel that again." Tears welled in my eyes as I stared at him, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of his gesture. It wasn't just the gift, it was the effort, the intention behind it. He had seen me in a way I hadn't let anyone see me in years. He hadn't just brought me art supplies. He'd given me back a part of myself I thought I'd lost. "I feel so loved," I whispered, more to myself than to him. Josh reached out and gently brushed a tear from my cheek. "You are Mom. More than you know." His words settled in my chest, filling a space that had felt hollow for so long. Without thinking, I reached up and cupped his face in my hands. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what this means to me." He smiled, leaning into my touch. "You don't have to thank me. I just want to see you happy." That moment lingered between us, the air heavy with unspoken emotions. It felt as though the boundaries we'd known our whole lives had shifted, softened. There was a closeness, an understanding that went deeper than anything I'd ever felt before. The rest of the day passed in a haze of quiet joy. Josh set up my new supplies in the spare room, transforming it into a makeshift studio. He was meticulous, arranging everything with care and joking about how he expected me to paint a masterpiece within the week. "Pressure much?" teased, rolling my eyes. "Only because I know you're amazing," he shot back with a wink. As I stood in the doorway of my new studio, watching him work, I felt a sense of hope I hadn't known in years. It wasn't just about the painting or the gift. It was about us. About how he'd come back into my life not just as my son, but as a man who saw me, who cherished me. That evening, as we sat together over dinner, his eyes met mine across the table, and I couldn't help but smile. For the first time in years I felt truly alive, truly seen. And it was all because of him. As I watched him eat, happily savoring the breakfast he'd made for us, I felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude. Josh had brought so much light back into my life, and the tenderness of his gestures had stirred something in me that I hadn't felt in years. He was more than my son now. He was a friend, a confidant, someone who truly saw me. Unable to stop myself, I rose from my chair and moved toward him. He looked up, startled but smiling, as I wrapped my arms around his broad shoulders from behind. I pressed my cheek against his as I spoke softly into his ear. "I love you," I said, my voice trembling with sincerity. "Thank you for everything you've done for me." Josh paused mid-bite, his fork suspended in the air, before setting it down and covering my hands with his. He tilted his head slightly to look up at me, his hazel eyes warm and full of emotion. "I love you too, Mom," he said, his voice steady. "More than anything." I squeezed him tightly before letting go, my heart full. He returned to his breakfast, a soft smile lingering on his lips, while I retreated to the studio he'd helped me set up. I couldn't shake the urge to create something, to capture the overwhelming sense of love and connection I felt. Standing in front of the blank canvas, I hesitated for a moment, wondering how to express everything stirring within me. Slowly I began to paint. Soft hues of red and pink gave way to bold strokes of gold and deep, warm blues. The image started to take form. Two abstract figures intertwined, their connection palpable even in their simplicity. The painting spoke of love, not just romantic, but deep, unconditional, and transformative. Time slipped away as I worked, the brush gliding over the canvas as though it had a life of its own. By the time I stepped back to admire the finished piece, the afternoon sunlight was slanting through the window. My heart raced as I stared at it, unsure if it was good enough, but feeling proud nonetheless. I barely noticed the sound of the front door opening until Josh's voice called out, "Mom, I'm back." "In here," I answered, my voice carrying excitement I hadn't intended to reveal. Josh appeared in the doorway moments later, his gym bag slung over one shoulder and his t-shirt clinging to him, damp from his workout. His gaze immediately fell on the canvas, and he froze. For a long moment he said nothing, his eyes wide with awe. "Wow," he finally murmured, stepping closer to the painting. "This is incredible." I felt my cheeks flush. "You think so?" "Think so," he repeated, turning to look at me. "Mom, this is amazing. The colors, the emotion, it's beautiful. You're so talented." His words were like a balm to my soul, and I couldn't help but smile shyly. "It's just something I felt inspired to do," I said softly. Josh stepped closer, his expression serious now. "You don't give yourself enough credit. You're incredible. This," he gestured to the painting, "proves it. And so does everything else about you." I blinked, his words sinking in, leaving me momentarily speechless. Before I could respond, he took my hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "You've always been amazing," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Nay, I don't think I say it enough, but you mean the world to me." I felt my heart swell, the intensity of his gaze making it hard to breathe. "Josh," I began, unsure of what to say. Before I could finish, he leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to my cheek. It lingered, delicate yet charged with an intimacy that left my skin tingling. When he pulled back, his eyes searched mine, and I saw a flicker of something I hadn't seen before, something tender, raw, and utterly sincere. My breath caught as I reached up, brushing my fingertips against the spot where his lips had been. "You don't know how much that means to me," I whispered. He smiled, his expression gentle. "I think I do." The air between us felt heavy with unspoken emotions, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was warm, reassuring, and filled with a sense of connection I hadn't known I was missing. As he stepped back, giving me space, I felt a strange mixture of longing and contentment. "That painting," he said, nodding toward the canvas, "isn't just about love. It is love. It is." I swallowed hard, nodding as my eyes welled with tears. "It is," I agreed. "It's everything we've been through, and everything we've become." Josh smiled again, his dimples making my heart ache in the best way. "And we're just getting started," he said, his voice full of promise. As he left the room to shower, I turned back to the painting, running my fingers lightly over the dried edges of the canvas. He was right, it wasn't just a painting. It was a reflection of the bond we'd built, of the love we shared, and of the way we'd both healed through each other. And in that moment, I felt certain that our journey, though unconventional, was only beginning.